The room in the caserne at Verdun was freezing, but the men inside were sweating. Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the most powerful commanders in the Western world. He looked at the map, then he looked at the man standing across from him, George S. Patton. Patton didn't look worried. He looked like he was enjoying himself. When Eisenhower asked the question everyone else was too afraid to voice, Patton didn't hesitate. He made a promise that sounded like a lie, a promise so bold that the room went silent. In that silence, Eisenhower leaned forward. He leaned toward his most volatile general and whispered something into his ear. It wasn't a command. It wasn't an encouragement. It was a cold realization that changed the trajectory of the war in a single breath. What he said in that moment was never meant to be heard, and it changed everything. But to understand why, we need to rewind 48 hours. 2 days earlier, the Allied High Command believed the war was effectively over. The maps in London and Paris were clear. The German army was a broken machine, retreating into the dark forests of the Ardennes to die. Intelligence reports described remnants and old men. The Allied line was thin, yes, but it was thin because there was nothing left to push against it. Eisenhower felt the weight of the world lifting. Orders were simple: keep the pressure on, wait for the weather to clear, and prepare for the final drive into Berlin. The system was working perfectly. Supplies were flowing, morale was at an all-time high, and the Christmas season was supposed to be a victory lap. In these briefings, there was no talk of disaster. There was only the logistics of winning. Patton was busy planning his own offensive further south, complaining that he wasn't getting enough fuel to finish the job. He believed the enemy was a ghost. Everything was stable. Everything was predictable. The Allied machine was so confident in its momentum that it had stopped looking at the shadows. What none of them realized was how wrong that assumption was. Then the reports stopped lining up. It started with a few panicked radio transmissions from the Ardennes. Frontline units reported hearing the heavy clanking of steel, much heavier than anything the Germans were supposed to have left. But the weather was a thick, gray blanket. Aerial reconnaissance was grounded. One detail didn't match the rest. A captured German soldier mentioned a massive buildup of Tiger tanks. The report was passed up the chain, and at every level, it was dismissed. Logic dictated that the Germans couldn't possibly mount a counteroffensive. They didn't have the fuel. They didn't have the men. But the silence from the front lines grew longer. Telephone wires were being cut. Small outposts were disappearing without firing a shot. There was a flickering crack in the narrative of the war, a small inconsistency that the generals chose to ignore because it didn't fit their timeline for victory. That decision would haunt them. By the time the sun rose on the morning of the attack, the crack had become a canyon. 250,000 German troops were pouring through the forest. The thin Allied line wasn't just breaking, it was being erased. In the headquarters, the mood shifted from confidence to confusion, and then to something much darker: ego-driven denial. Instead of slowing down or pulling back, the commanders in the rear doubled down. They ordered units to hold ground that had already been lost. They refused to believe the scale of the disaster because admitting the truth meant admitting they had been completely outplayed. Pulling back now would admit something worse. That control was already gone. Reports began to filter in about Bastogne, a vital crossroads town now surrounded. If it fell, the road to the sea was open. The Allies were facing the very real possibility of a second Dunkirk. The tension in the command centers was no longer about strategy, it was about survival. That's when the situation crossed the point of no return. This is the moment history books sanitize, but the diaries tell a different story. Eisenhower called the emergency meeting at Verdun. He didn't want the polished versions of the truth. He wanted the raw reality. He looked at his generals, men who had spent years building their reputations, and saw the cracks in their masks. Patton arrived, flamboyant as ever, but behind the ivory-handled revolvers was a man who knew his career hung by a thread. When Eisenhower laid out the map and showed the bulge in their lines, the atmosphere was suffocating. Eisenhower asked Patton how long it would take him to pivot his entire Third Army, hundreds of thousands of men and tanks, 90 degrees and drive north into the freezing hell of the Ardennes to save Bastogne. Experts said it would take a week, maybe 2. Patton looked Eisenhower in the eye and said, 3 days. The room gasped. It was a logistical impossibility. It was an arrogant, dangerous boast. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower said something very different to his inner circle. Not for the public, not for morale, just the truth about the man he was betting the entire war on. He saw Patton's bravado not as a plan, but as a desperate gamble by a man who feared irrelevance more than death. But he didn't say it out loud. Not yet. From that moment on, nothing moved the same way again. Patton left that meeting and began one of the most complex maneuvers in military history. But it wasn't the heroic charge the movies show. It was a nightmare of frozen gears, sliding trucks, and exhausted men being pushed past the point of human endurance. Orders became reactions. Strategy became survival. The cost was being paid in the snows of the Ardennes by 19-year-olds who didn't know their generals were playing a game of high-stakes poker with their lives. The Bulge continued to grow. The pressure on Bastogne was reaching a breaking point. Every hour Patton was delayed was another hour of slaughter. The Allied command was no longer a well-oiled machine. It was a group of desperate men watching a clock. And this wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the realization that even if Patton made it, the war had changed. The illusion of a clean, easy victory was dead. This wasn't just a decision. It was the moment Eisenhower realized that power has limits. When Patton made his 72-hour promise, the room thought he was crazy. But Eisenhower's whisper at Verdun revealed the cold calculus of leadership. He leaned in and told Patton that if he failed, there would be no one left to save him, or the men at Bastogne. It was a recognition that they were no longer in control of the war was in control of them. Patton did reach Bastogne. He performed the miracle, but the cost was a scar on the Allied psyche that never truly healed. It revealed that the men at the top were just as susceptible to blind spots, ego, and panic as anyone else. They had been humbled by a dying enemy because they had started to believe their own myths. The whisper wasn't a secret code. It was a confession of vulnerability. Patton's 72-hour dash is remembered as one of the greatest feats in military history. But we have to ask the question, was Patton a genius who saw a path no one else could? Or was he a reckless egoist who got lucky while thousands of men paid the price for the high command's earlier blindness? If Eisenhower hadn't let Patton take that gamble, if he had played it safe and followed the textbook, would the war have ended sooner, or would it have ended in a disaster that changed the map of Europe forever? Was this leadership under pressure, or the moment judgment failed? History never agreed. What do you think? Did Patton save the day, or did his ego just happen to match the desperation of the moment? Let me know in the comments.